Yep. Mr. Agus Palcher, good afternoon as well. University of the Highlands and Islands, my name, for those that don't know me, is Gary Campbell. I am Key Account Director here for the University. Today, I'm delighted with Catriona Maclean, who is Chief Executive of the Crofting Commission. And we're going to be looking at some of the issues that affect crofting in the 21st century. It's an old tradition, and we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. Why do we do these? It's really to bring the business community, the students, the staff all together, and to look at issues that are pertinent for our region. As you know, the university covers an area. You find this difficult to believe. If you get a line across from the bottom of southern Greenland, and you get a line across the globe from the top of Southern Ireland, that is the distance that UHI actually spans. It's huge. You go from the top of one straight way down to the bottom of the Mull of Kintyre. So we have a lot of different cultural issues within that. As you can imagine, we've got Nordic issues in the north. We've got a lot of crofting communities that we cover, and then of course we've got Gaelic as well. And out east, we're out as far as Murray, out as far almost as Buckie, and we've got all the communities that are there as well, and then the central belt to a certain extent, Perth too. So as you can imagine, there's a big number of issues, but we'd like to cover them, and we're delighted here that Catriona has come today. Just like to welcome those that are in video conferencing as well. And what we'll do is we'll have a chat with Catriona about various crofting things, and then we'll have a chance for some Q&A from the room, and also then from those out in video conferencing. And then afterwards, for us here, we'll have a wee bite of lunch. Just a quick health and safety announcement. If there's a fire alarm, it's real. The door is over here. Please follow me, and we all gather outside in the grass outside. And if you want the Thai bake, or as they say up in the north, the Brit who's it, they're out through out in the reception area. Okay. So, welcome along, Tina. Thank you very much for coming along. From a crofting family yourself.
I am.
So how did you end up here as Chief Executive of the Crofting Commission? What's the story?
Well, it's a bit of a journey, you're right. I'm a daughter of the Croft. My mum and dad are still crofters in the Western Isles. And I started my civil service career many years ago now as a filing clerk in the old Crofting Commission. And I worked as a casual. I wasn't even actually permanently employed there, but I became permanently employed, and I worked my way up through the Crofters Commission.
Right.
After about 15 years, I left the commission and I moved on to other parts of government. Mm-hmm. I worked in housing, I've worked in justice, I've worked in community planning. So I've always been in the public sector, but I've worked in a variety of different settings. And then the job came up in the Crofting Commission.
Very much a distinction.
It is. And I think it's something that perhaps is only now becoming apparent, is there is a big difference. And it was actually quite interesting for me going from my recollections of the Crofters Commission to join the Crofting Commission. There is a shift in emphasis in the organisation, so the job was advertised and I applied. The interesting thing for me is that all the learning that I've had in various areas that I've been in the public sector has actually been really helpful in taking on this job as Chief Executive of the Crofting Commission.
It sounds like it. I mean, when you talk about justice, you talk about housing, and of course, crofting as an industry or a culture, everything, all these bits and pieces come into it. Right?
That's right. Yeah.
And just a quick one. What is the difference between the Crofters Commission and the Crofting Commission?
I think the emphasis again is the Crofters Commission was very much about crofter and what they wanted and what their priorities were. The Crofting Commission, the legislation has changed its focus and is now on the system. The background to that is that when the Act was being revisited and they were looking at new legislation, the consultation that was part of that legislative process demonstrated that people felt that there was too much emphasis on what the short-term desires of the individual were at the expense of the system as a whole. And I think that set the tone for the changes in the crofting legislation, which still has to balance the short-term desires of the individual, but has to see those desires set in the context of what is best for the systems of whole.
It's a much larger thing.
It definitely took me some time to get my head around that change, and actually, as I say, I think it's only now that it's starting to be recognised wider afield.
And I understand that. I mean, I myself am from a crofting family, and it's always the croft that was talked about.
Yeah,
I understand that, and I think it's interesting because a lot of people, especially older people, probably still think in those terms.
Yeah.
But moving on a little bit, of the history of crofting. Where did it come from? Who was the first person that invented a croft, and why did they do so?
Well, it came from the clearances. It was the system was developed after the clearances where people who had small holdings were removed from they had no rights, they had no security of tenure, they were removed arbitrarily to make way for, you've heard of the tune of the stag and the black oil.
We'll go to the oil, please.
So, that's where its foundations were. It was a recognised system of. It's difficult to say. Would you say it was agriculture? I always think, and it's something again I think we have to recognise. Crofting was never meant to be a sole occupation for people. It was in the past, in that a lot of people had that was all they had. But if you think back even way before the Crofting Acts, the people who lived in the land then worked in the estate, went to the fishing, did other things, the herring industry, all sorts of things, as well as having a small piece of ground on which they kept their cows, their tatties did that. It hefted people to the land. It created communities in rural areas. So that's kind of its history. The crofting legislation, after the Napier Commission, who went round after the clearances, the Crofting Act, the 1955 Act, gave security of tenure to individuals. And that's what it has done. It was a response to the clearances. The 55 Act then set the legislation for that.
But let's say, coming to the present day and the Crofting Commission, and you're looking at the bigger system, if crofts were never designed to be economically viable in their own right, why would you want to keep them going? What's the benefits to the Highlands of keeping a system going that people can't make a living from? Although maybe, looking at things like the good life and people want to be environmentally friendly, etc., might see this as something, but it's a system designed never to deal with that. So why would we carry on?
Well, if you were to take a map of the Highlands and Islands and you were to look at places where they had a strong culture, strong Gaelic roots, a strong environmental impact, low impact, a good range of species. If you were to look at where there are people living, and you were then to overlay the crofting, where the crofting system is, you would find that the two are that they're there together. They're all, but that somehow that crofting system actually helps to create cohesive communities in places where there is no protection from the crofting legislation. There are no communities. So in the past, I know that the land is different in different parts of Scotland, but in the past there were crofts. If you go into Aberdeenshire and you drive around the Aberdeenshire rural communities, you'll see croft this and croft that. They were called crofts, so the same kind of principle of small-scale agriculture was there, but because they didn't benefit from the protection of crofting legislation, those communities have not remained in the same format. Small land, because it's not agriculturally viable, has been swallowed up into larger and larger units to make it more viable in terms of its agricultural production. And the feeling is that what that's been lost then is that community cohesion. Okay, so it's a much more, there's really a social element to Absolutely.
This. And is that, I suppose that's really what you're talking about in terms of the new Act and the Crofting Commission, that you're looking at that in a much wider scale rather than just, I suppose looking back to when childhood people filling in forms for subsidies so that they could continue to keep a couple of sheep. Sorry, maybe that's me being cynical, but certainly that's how I saw it.
Well, in any system where you've got 18,000 people, you will always have somebody who's doing that very thing. So some people see it as a pension, some people see it as a really strong way of life. I know in my community and certainly in my family, we view ourselves as the custodians of the land. It's a system that it's part of my history and culture, and it's certainly in our family, we don't see it as our asset, we see ourselves as custodians of something that will go on to produce benefits for people in the future. And I'm sure that there are many families that see it as an integral part of their life and their culture.
Moving on now, today's the day that the census was out. It was mentioned last week, there was a lot of publicity about it. And you've written already to the Crofters and said warning them that the census is coming and getting some free data. The census goes out today. Yeah. What as a commissioner are you hoping to get from this census?
Well, I think first of all I want to set that in context, Gary. I mean, the first thing is you have to understand that this annual notice or census is set down in the legislation. This is not just a whim of the Crofting Commission who decided it was a great idea.
This is up to the government.
The legislation which was passed requires every crofter to submit information every year on what they are doing with their land and whether they are complying with their duties. And the duties, again, are not the duties that have been made up by the Crofting Commission, but they're the duties that are in the legislation. And so to gather that information, the annual census is the method by which we will gather that information. What do we hope to get out of it? Well, it's interesting because very recently we've gone through the CAP reform, if you like, where they're looking at what kind of support agriculture should get from Europe. Now, what's been very difficult, in the same way as I described earlier, what you said to me, what does Crofting bring? We've got this sort of instinctive belief that this is what Crofting brings, but there's actually very little hard data to back up those instincts. And so when we were being asked by government, as we are, to advise the Minister on things like CAP reform, it was difficult to be able to back up our views with hard information to allow us to advance a case for Crofting.
Right.
Because there is no information. Now, people might say, oh, well, there is information on the agricultural survey, census, and that gives information of one particular type, but that isn't, you can't disaggregate that down into just Crofting. So what happens there is that when you're trying to make a case, you can only use information which is about agriculture, pure and simple. You can't make the case about the social, wider benefits that a system like Crofting can bring to Scotland and to the people in those communities, and therefore you cannot make the case to have almost like niche support for something that is unique and is delivering something that is far wider than purely agriculture.
And you cover that in the census?
What we've tried to do with the census is we've tried to keep it as simple as possible and to answer the questions that the legislation requires. The easiest way for me to think about it is when I apply to tax my car, I'm asked whether I've got a valid MOT and whether I've got insurance, and that is a requirement before I can get my car taxed. And we all have to tax, well, we all should. There will be people who don't, but we all have to tax our cars. And it's the same thing here. The Crofting Act asks for a number of questions to be answered, so we've kept it absolutely to what is in the legislation. And just like your car tax, if you've got 6 crofts, you've got to answer for each and every one of them. So if you had 6 cars, you'd have to tax your 6 cars.
Yeah,
Same principle.
I understand, and I think it's very clear here that's coming out that, certainly some of in the run-up to this, a number of people said there's questions we would like to ask and such like, and I think maybe some people have missed the point here that it's legislation that you've been asked to monitor, and then basically you've been asked to enact what's been put in the legislation and actually carry that out. It's not something that you as a Crofting Commission have invented.
That's right.
Yeah, so and I think that's a very important point, because in lots of cases, unfortunately, I mean, you see in many other areas when legislation is enacted, that at that point, any chance to have your say, if you weren't happy with it, it's gone, and maybe that was a few years ago for those that maybe aren't happy with it, you maybe having to be asked to say.
Yes, well, there was a consultation on that, and that the Act is what came out of that consultation. I mean, obviously, any legislation that there is, if people are unhappy about it, they can speak to their MP and their ministers, whoever. People have that avenue. They can express their concerns to us, but we are actually not the vehicle for being able to change that. We can advise ministers. We can express what people are saying to us, but it's not for us to. We can't change the legislation. It's the Scottish Government's legislation.
And it'd be fascinating, to see the results of the census, in terms of the parameters you put in. Just one thing that comes out of this about the absentee crofters and having to live within 32 kilometres of a croft. What's that? I think some people say, well, the family croft like you're talking about, but and I've gone away because I've had to go away to work. I'm intending coming back to that. I'm now an absentee crofter. How does that affect that person if they feel that they're, right now I'm not using it, or I've got somebody cutting hair on it or something like that. So how would they deal with that?
Well, if they've got somebody working it, formalise that. There is a mechanism. There's mechanisms for people to resolve their situations if they find they're in breach of their duties. I think the other thing, there is always a focus on what you've just described as absenteeism. My understanding of the duties that have been enshrined in the legislation are around the concerns during the consultation phase were around people who were not resident on their crofts, but they were around how do we retain population in these rural areas, but they were also around not just people who are there, but are they actually working their crofts? And one of the big concerns during that consultation phase was about neglect, where people do have crofts but don't work. Okay? And in response to that, one of the duties is that you must not neglect your croft and you must work. So you have a duty to occupy your croft or live within a certain period of a certain area. It's all actually in this little census leaflet. It tells you what the duties are.
It's on your website.
And it's on the website. So it's to be resident, not to neglect, to cultivate and maintain, or to put it to what's called, in legal terms, another purposeful use. And that means, to put it to a use, that means you might not be doing something agricultural on it, but it means that in the future, should someone want to work it in a traditional or agricultural way, the land is still there.
So you haven't built a factory?
Well, you might be able to do that in part, but not all of it. So what we will do is we will help people to, where they're not meeting their duties, to take steps to rectify that. So, for example, your example of someone cutting hay on the croft, sublet it. Apply to sublet your croft. There is a formal mechanism. The Act makes provision for that.
And you're still the crofter?
You're still the crofter? Absolutely.
Yes.
You say, I'm coming back in 7 years, 5 years, whatever, and in the meantime, Gary's going to be subletting my croft and he's already using it. Apply to the Commission. It's very clear from our policy plan what our policies are in relation to what kind of applications we can approve and refuse. And again, that's available on the website or in hard copy if people want it. So this is very much about self-regulation to a degree, that communities will look at themselves and will actually bring themselves in line if they will use the system that is there to ensure they're meeting their duties, and we're there to help them do that.
It sounds like, from my own experience of crofting rural Argyll, it sounds like a lot of the informal arrangements that are there at the moment just need to be formalised in a manner that would be approved by yourselves, and then it will carry on.
That's right.
Just moving forward, if somebody wants to get into crofting, they maybe moved to the area, or maybe their grandparents had a croft many years ago, they don't now, and they would like to become a crofter. How would they go about that?
It's one of the big difficulties. I think, again, just before I answer your question, it's again one of the key differences between the Crofters Commission and the Crofting Commission. We are the regulator if you like, we respond to what's happening out there. So if someone wants something to happen, they apply to the Commission, we apply the legislation to that process, and we deliver an answer within policy.
So what you're going
We
to tell
don't
us,
have
you
any crofts.
don't have a bank of crofts
We
available?
don't, exactly that, you're absolutely right. We don't have any crofts, and we can't direct crofts. So if you pitched up tomorrow, I couldn't say, well, there's a croft over there, go and get it. It's part of what we're trying to find out, or we hope we will gain from the census, is that people might get into crofting, be that as a full tenant or as a sub-tenant, because they can express their interest in croft to the Crofting Federation. They can say they're interested, they can express that demand, and then as part of the census process, then perhaps they can get a croft that way. That people realise, well, I'm actually not going to use it, but I wouldn't mind if Gary got a sub-tenancy.
Yeah.
And maybe by getting that first step in the door, we have experience where people have started off not having full tenancies, but rather they get a sub-tenancy and then they can move on, or they get experience, and then a full croft tenancy comes up.
Okay.
Quite often it is, there's no doubt about it, people have a very, very strong emotional connection to their particular land, not necessarily to their neighbours, but to their own particular land, because it's been something that their families have fought and died for in the past, worked, it's part of their history, and so therefore giving up croft is quite a significant emotional thing, and we as a Commission recognise that, and we do have the powers. There's absolutely, the legislation says we do have the powers, but these powers are used only in most extreme circumstances. What we want to do is to work with people and with communities who want to use this legislation in a positive way that actually supports the system, because all the commissioners, it's amazing, about over half of the people who work in it or in the office have connections with crofts. All the commissioners have connections with crofts, and there is a huge desire to see the system develop and maintain, to see it thrive, really.
And then you've got people working with you, see, who understand problems on the ground, who
Sure.
intended,
Absolutely.
and they get the day-to-day issues.
Yeah.
And just, I'm conscious of time, and I'm sure there's some questions, but from what's the best thing about being a crofter?
Different things for different people. For me, I think that the opportunities, especially just now, people have started to really feel much more, that it's much more important about the provenance of things, about their footprint in the world, and you can see how crofting actually can use that as an opportunity. So we've been seeing really inventive things happening on common grazings, which is the sort of shared land that crofts often have, where we've got wind turbines going up that's providing communities with their local electricity, where there's micro-hydro schemes where people are selling food into local markets so that the provenance is known, things like that. I think that's a real opportunity. There's no doubt about it that it's a hard life living in remote rural areas, but the inventiveness, the coming together of people, for me, is what's really important. The strength of community, I think, is what I find the most inspiring thing about crofting communities.
Thank you very much. Just before, I'll go to the room first, I think, and then we'll go to those that have joined us by video conference. Is there anyone in the room who'd like to ask any questions? Yes, sir. If I could ask you to say your name so beforehand, everybody, and then we'll know who's asking the question.
My name's Ronnie Johnson. I'm from Shetland. I'm a crafter. I served 2 terms as Crafters Commissioner. I'm chairman of the local cooperative with 300 crafter members. There's quite a lot that can be said with what Catriona's just vocalised there. Some things that I still feel disappointed that the Scottish Government has never quite realised. Catriona is quite right in how she describes the creation of the 2010 Act. Perhaps what was left out was the commissioners were never consulted about what was to be in the 2010 Act. We had one after dinner engagement with one minister, and we had 20 minutes with another minister, and the result was the 2010 Act, which, to my mind, is overly rigid, overly bureaucratic piece of legislation which does nothing other than keep bureaucrats shuffling paper and solicitors in well-paid jobs. It ignores the dynamism that's required in crofting communities. There are communities that work, that click, that can be viewed in terms of sustainability, and there are communities that don't. The legislation was created for the ones that don't, and not for the ones that do. I suppose what I had hoped when I saw this was on today, what I hoped to hear was a description of what crofting would be for the 21st century. It is not an old tradition. It is an old form of social engineering. It has differences, certainly, but it is not unique to Scotland. Crofting can be found all over Europe. Any linguists in the audience will recognise the word torp from Norse, which is basically croft. The form of tenanted small pieces of land is a very common form of land holding.
I could pick you up on something there. I mean, I think that today's probably not the place, because nobody, I think, in here, we don't have any MSPs that can actually answer your question about the legislation, because unfortunately the chance to make the comments is gone unless you go and vote out the people that you're unhappy with or petition Parliament, I would imagine. But just on the thing about social engineering, that comes back to how it started. I mean, is that a valid point, or has it moved on from there?
Well, I mean, I don't know how to answer that question, to be perfectly frank. I mean, it is what it is. It started, it's the protection that the crofting legislation gave it. I mean, how it's ended up, there's no doubt about it that the Crofting Act's first thing that the Commission must consider when considering an application's population retention. So, in that respect, you could call it social engineering.
But that's, and also I think the other point that you made on it was, that some communities work well and others don't.
Sure.
I mean, surely that's why it was that it would be addressed again, that maybe the 1955 Act wasn't seen to be working, leaving crofting communities that weren't working.
Well, there's an ebb and a flow, and I'm sure you'll recognise that, Ronnie. There's times when some communities are very vibrant, and there's other times where they fall into times when they're not so vibrant, and the fact that they're protected by the legislation means that they're there in that cycle, they're still there. Whereas if they weren't afforded the protection of the crofting legislation, they may not get the chance to come back. That's some of the thinking behind it, is my understanding of what thinking.
Can I reply at all? Or would you prefer to move on?
If we could move on.
Yes.
We've got some time. Okay. I'm just conscious, we try to keep the things
Yes.
within an hour, if that's all right. Is anyone else any questions in the room? Yeah.
Ian Scott, I have a house in the West Coast crofting community. And one of the issues that continually comes up is absentee crofters with holiday homes who contribute nothing to the local society apart from £60 a weekend for the changeover for some poor person to go and clean their house from them. And the issue is really both with the census and when crofts are being transferred, things like that. The Crofting Commission asks if they live on the croft. They say yes, and it moves on. Is there a way to be a bit more dynamic about how you deal with that?
Well, there's potentially a number of things. First of all, I mean, it is a criminal offence to lie on the form,
Yeah.
How you would then decide what to do about that's a whole different thing. In life, we have to rely to a greater or lesser extent on people behaving in an honest way. We do get reports on regulatory applications, and we do ask for the views of communities. And it's a balance. The decision is usually a balance of what the individual is saying and what the community is saying. One of the things that hopefully the census, it's really difficult for us to say at this point because it's the very first time this has ever been done. But one of the things that we hope that will come from this census is that we will undertake a rolling programme of actually looking to see what information has been provided by the census and actually seeing what that looks like in real terms. But at this stage, we're very much unsure about how we could do that. We're a very small organisation with quite a large constituency, if you like, both in terms of geography and in terms of people. One of the things that we are looking into at the moment is to work with our partners in geographically targeted areas to look at not just whether someone's absent on a croft or not, but what opportunities are there in a community, which of the public organisations can support changing that or providing value, adding value to that and giving people more of a chance, and then that's when perhaps our regulation comes in behind that. So if we had, if you like, some sort of geographical targeting where we had the development companies, we had the councils, we had a whole lot of people together looking at that to see where they could contribute, and it then turned out that there were also a number of people who weren't resident or who hadn't replied to the census or whatever, we could then take some action to address that. So we're part of a bigger picture. Mm-hmm. As and of ourselves, we're not going to resolve your particular problem. We can only do that as part of a bigger picture.
I suppose I'm seeing things that there is information available. Very often these people will be doing something through planning or acquiring a croft through and it goes to planning. They say they're resident, and you can tell from the 3-storey glass-fronted house that it's it's with 8 bedrooms that there isn't a family that big locally. It's very clear what they're going to be used for, and it's actually quite hard to get the new Grand Planning Committee to actually work together and ensure that someone's going to live on that.
I think it's an issue as well. We've got a lot of houses in Croft are separate from the Croft. They can be. Yeah. Anybody else in video conferencing would like to join us for any questions? Okay. Sorry. Yes, Matthew.
I don't know. Can you hear me? Because I don't know how to use this.
Oh, we can hear you. You've clearly learned very quickly because we can hear you very well.
Okay. Well, I'm really quite interested in what's been going on. I'm an absentee crofter with no house in my croft, owning a massive 2 acres of uncultivable land in the harshest part of the Highlands and Islands. And for 10 years I have been fighting the Crofters Commission and now the Crofting Commission. I have lost gloriously, hugely lost, and now I have to give my croft to my brother. That's fine. I'm not objecting to that. What I do find difficult to accept, though, and I'm so pleased to hear you say that you're from a crofting background yourself, because my connection with the Crofting Commission suggests that your employees, the people that deal with crofters, are not very understanding and are not very sensitive. I have had huge problems with the sheer bureaucracy of your organisation. The bureaucracy is horrific and the expense is enormous. I am pouring money into the private owners of the Stornoway Gazette to advertise week after week that I'm registering my croft, that I'm registering for the first time, that I'm assigning my croft to my brother. And I wonder, why are crofters being asked to spend so much money, give it to private people, when the Crofting Commission should be on the side of the crofter?
Well, comment on your individual case, because that wouldn't be appropriate. But in terms of croft registration, That is, again, a legislative requirement. The Commission have no control over the fact that you have to advertise your croft in the newspaper, and have no control over the fee that you will pay for that registration. That's laid down in legislation with regard to the registers. It's Registers of Scotland who run the registration programme. It's their register. We have been given the responsibility for administering that process, but we receive none of the fees along with it. So we actually have had to take on this as an extra duty without any resources to do that. And as I say, the fact that you have to advertise it is enshrined in law, and that is equally true of your assignation to your brother. All applications where they have to be advertised in the press, that is stipulated in the Crofting Act. So again, we have no control over that.
Matthew, thank you for that. I think that one of the things that's come up is the big sign behind you might be someone that you want to go and speak to about this. It appears that the power unfortunately resides in Edinburgh over this one. David, at the back,
just a quick one. David Bryan, Social Enterprise Academy. You mentioned at the end of your presentation some of the innovative entrepreneurial things that communities are doing on their common grazings. I suppose most of that is social enterprise. And I was just wondering if the Crofting Commission had any sort of role in stimulating that activity, because I think there's a lot more scope for it.
Yeah, the Crofters Commission had both the duty to regulate crofting and the duty to develop crofting. That was removed from us in 2010 when the new legislation came in. We are purely the regulator. The development of crofting is no longer a responsibility that the Commission have at all. What we are trying to do is work very closely with those who do have responsibility for developing rural and crofting communities to ensure that where we can, where people require some sort of regulatory application to allow them to proceed, we're trying to make sure that people understand the process so that we can make it simple as possible. And we are very much trying to stimulate our partners to see what they are doing to help support crofting communities. But there was a very clear distinction made in 2010 that took away from the Commission its development function.
Okay.
So can I just ask whose responsibility that is now then, if it's not with you?
Well, development is with HIE. They are the development organisation for this area, along with other people like councils, like the Scottish Government in terms of various support for crofting. So
nothing
There's
specific,
no specific
in terms of the role that you used to do. Also, can I just ask, the man in Hollywood just saying about complaining about costs for putting in a newspaper. We are in the 21st century, and whilst newspapers still exist, and particularly maybe within crofts, people do till that is the main route by which a lot of people get their local news. What would be the route to potentially change the legislation from the sort of like the grassroots in terms of saying, well, actually, what about using internet purposes to change that to take away the costs?
It could be that. It's something that, as I say, it's absolutely written in the legislation. It's got to be a newspaper. Okay?
I think the message here
So,
is...
change that. It could be that if we're going to change that, there could be an argument that it's advertised on the Commission's website in the same way as planning is advertised. I've got no hard and fast answer. I'm very open to what the answer could be, but it would require a legislative change to make it happen.
I think I'm very conscious of time because we try to wrap these things up, including giving people a right punch within an hour. I think the answer here, very clearly coming out, is that there is legislation. Your job is to make sure that legislation is carried out as the government wants it. And if you want a change, it's with Holyrood. It really is at the end of the day.
There is. We are aware. I think Ronnie raised it quite rightly. We are aware that there are difficulties with the current legislation, shall we say, and we are trying very hard to work again with partners. That there's some people involved in the sort of legal aspect and some of our area assessors, we're looking at to see what are the big main problems and can we gather all these issues together and produce a cohesive case for the Scottish Government to say, well, here are some of the big problems and here are some potential solutions, but it will be very much up to them to make that final decision, whether there is legislative time and the will to change them.
Well, sorry folks,